Some of the wealthiest families in America live and make their money in New York City. For decades, a small number of families have made fortunes as the main purchasers and developers of New York City real estate. While some of these families are very well known, others prefer to keep most things about themselves private. One of these private families is the Durst family, who own and operate the billion-dollar Durst organization that owns and operates some of New York's most famous and recognizable buildings. Despite the glossy image the Dursts paint when they do small amounts of publicity, they have a very dark secret. One they never discuss, unless forced to under oath. That secret is the erased member of the Durst family, the scion and heir of the Durst family, Robert Durst. And that's who we're going to be discussing today, the unbelievable life, story, and crimes of Robert Durst. Robert Durst spent almost 5 decades using his money and power to escape any consequences from his many crimes, but his money and power were not the only things assisting him to escape consequence. Durst also used his family and friends to help and enable him, but those were not the only people influenced by what they could get out of Durst and his fortune. As many of the lawyers, filmmakers, police, district attorneys, judges, and prosecutors, supposedly on the opposite side of Durst, have committed some actions that at best are questionable, at worst highly unethical, and some that may result in an investigation. So many people helped Durst escape consequence for so long that the only reason we're talking about this story today is because of a chain reaction that was set off in September 2001 in Galveston, Texas, when a small boy went fishing. And as if the life of Durst wasn't bizarre enough, the story will also include one of the most jaw-dropping moments in television history. There's much more to this story than most people know. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in to the dark, twisted, and unbelievable life and crimes of Robert Durst. A teenage boy in Galveston, Texas went fishing with his father and upon walking to the water, made a gruesome discovery. Floating in the bay were a number of black plastic trash bags, some of which had slits on the side and some of which had been opened to reveal what was inside. The black trash bags contained dismembered limbs and a torso. Of course, the police were called and descended upon the scene, examining the bags. The police noticed that they did not find the head of the deceased, and they did find a newspaper among other items that had a delivery address on it for an apartment that was not very far away. The police went to the address and found a plethora of evidence. The cops had ran the deceased fingerprints, and the body was identified as Morris Black, who lived in one of the apartments at the address. Outside of the apartments, the police found a trail of blood which led to Mr. Black's neighbor's apartment 2, the exact address that was on the newspaper. All of this led the police to get a search warrant, and the building's owner told them that the apartment was rented by a deaf-mute woman called Dorothy Signer, who traveled a lot and wasn't always home. The cops entered and they found Dorothy's apartment to be simple and neat, but noticed drop cloths in the kitchen. And when the drop cloths were removed, they found small cuts in the plastic floor. They tore up the panels and found blood underneath that matched Mr. Morris Black. So they knew that Black had been killed and dismembered inside this apartment. After going through the apartment trash, they found an optometrist's receipt for glasses for someone named Robert Durst. The detective for the case, Cody Catazales, went to the optometrist and asked them that if on the long shot that this person turned up to collect the glasses, that they call him. A few days later, the detective was very surprised to hear from the eye clinic when they called to say that a man was there to collect the glasses right this second. The detectives rushed down and they were able to stop the man as he was pulling out of the parking lot. When the police walked up to detain the man, they saw a bone saw in the back back of his car. This and everything else led them to arrest the man, and when they brought him back to the police station, they identified him as Robert Durst. When he was being booked and fingerprinted, the police explained to him what he was arrested for, and Durst asked them what he should do. The detectives explained to him that his bail was $250,000, and thinking that this enormous figure would mean that he had no choice but to stay in jail, the detectives half-jokingly asked him, "Well, do you have $250,000?" Durst simply replied, "Well, not on me." This odd and flippant response immediately caused the detectives to raise an eyebrow. Very quickly after the conversation, Durst called a woman named Debrah Charatan. He told her that he had been arrested and what he had been arrested for, and that he needed $250,000 for bail. Debrah immediately and casually replied that this was no problem and that the money would be there in the morning. The money did arrive the very next morning. Durst posted bail, and the detectives immediately went to work finding out exactly who was Robert Durst. Why was he posing as a deaf-mute woman living in a rundown $300 a month apartment in Galveston, Texas, especially when he easily had access to over $250,000 at the drop of a hat? Also, more importantly, why had he taken the life of his neighbor? Who exactly was Robert Durst? And while these questions have straightforward answers, what happens next is not straightforward at all, as these happenings set off a chain reaction that spanned the next 20 years and resulted in the exposure of the heir apparent of one of New York's wealthiest families, the Dursts. So in order to explain what Robert Durst was doing in Texas and what the hell was going on, we need to go back to the beginning, and I need to provide some additional context to you. I'll also be pointing out some things throughout the first couple of chapters that you'll want to bank and flag in your memory for later, because there's things that happen throughout this story that don't really seem significant at the time, but are very significant later on. So Robert Durst was born into an incredibly wealthy family, the Dursts. They are one of the kind of 5 main big players in New York real estate, these New York real estate dynasty families, another of the families being the Trumps, probably the most well-known. And the Dursts are very much the opposite of the Trumps when it comes to lifestyle and how they spend their money, because the Dursts are known for being incredibly cheap, and there's some things that they do that just seem ludicrous when you have this insane wealth. And I'm not talking about, oh, they're frugal and that's how you keep money. I mean things like Robert Durst once got food stamps because he wanted to just do it because it would save him money. So he's literally a billionaire on food stamps, and that is kind of the person that we're dealing with in this story. So Robert Durst was born to Seymour and Bernice Durst in 1943. He was born on April 12th, and he is the oldest of 4 children. He has a brother after him, Douglas, a sister, Wendy, and another brother, Thomas. He was born into incredible wealth, and his family runs the Durst organization that was started by his grandfather, Joseph Durst, and Robert Durst's father, Seymour, took over the Durst organization in 1974 when the grandfather, Joseph Durst, passed away, Seymour's father. And from that point on, it was assumed that Robert, the eldest, the scion, that he would end up being the next CEO, chairman, person to run the Durst organization. So Scarsdale is where they grew up in New York. It's a very affluent area, one of the most affluent areas not only in the state, probably in the country. And he did not get along with his brother that was after him, Douglas. He didn't really get on great with any of his siblings. The Durst organization has over 13 million square feet of real estate in New York. They have 3,500 at least rental properties, and they have some very significant buildings. They have a massive amount of property in Times Square. They have the Bank of America Tower. The Durst organization also won the bid to develop One World Trade Center, and they own a 10% stake in the buildings that have been constructed on the site that was the former Twin Towers. In January 2004, Forbes estimated the Durst organization was worth over $8.1 billion. In 1950, when Robert Durst was only 7 years old, his mother passed away. She took her own life by jumping off the roof of the family's home in Scarsdale. At the time, some newspapers reported it as she fell because it seems as though the Durst family kind of pressured, or that's the story that they put out. But people that were at the scene, there was over 200 firefighters and police at the scene. They reported that she did in fact take her own life. Robert Durst has gone on media appearances and interviews and said that he actually witnessed his mother taking her life, but his brother and his siblings have contested this and said that they actually weren't even there. They were sent to the neighbor's house because this whole thing went on for a long time, hence 200 police and firefighters being able to get there. So most people think that that was a lie that Durst told, and you'll see that lying is pretty much what he just does, as it is a pattern throughout the rest of his life. After his mother passed away, he didn't get on with his father, and he had major issues with his brother Douglas, that was the brother after him, and he just had a lot of problems that really nobody really addressed too much. They did try and send him to a psychiatrist, but nothing really came from it, and he used to run away a lot. He did graduate from Scarsdale High School, and then he went to Lehigh University where he got a degree. He then moved to California for graduate school, and he enrolled at Claremont University where he did end up getting his master's in economics. But bizarrely, in his last year, he also enrolled at UCLA for a master's in economics. And although he graduated from Claremont, he never graduated from UCLA, and he ended up taking a leave of absence and then never went back. But I bring up UCLA because at UCLA, he met one of his lifelong best friends, which was a woman named Susan Berman. Susan Berman and her relationship with Robert Durst will become extremely significant later on in the video. In the early 1970s, Durst moved back to the East Coast, and his high school and lifelong best friend, Stuart Altman, ended up introducing him to a woman that lived in the same building as Stuart, which some people report that Durst owned this building, but I've never been able to confirm that. And Stuart introduced him to Kathie McCormack. Kathie and Durst got along immediately and pretty much started dating straight away. Durst ended up moving to Vermont and opening a sort of health food store that was called All Good Things, and that will also be significant later. So they were living in Vermont, and Kathie actually was a dental hygienist when she met Durst. She was only 19 and he was 29 at the time, and also he is a multi-millionaire and a lot older, so he obviously has a lot more say in what they're doing, where they're going. Also, it's the early 1970s. I mean, only in 1974, I think, was the Equal Act so that women could get bank accounts. And although women could get bank accounts from the 1960s, pretty much every major bank, you had to have your husband's signature on it. So only in 1974 were women allowed to have their own bank accounts. So it's kind of important too to remember that this story is taking place like over a really long period of time and the kind of differences that were happening, because Kathie was a dental hygienist. She then, when they were living in Vermont, went to nursing school, and after she graduated from nursing school, she ended up getting accepted to medical school. She had transferred to NYU when she was in nursing school because Durst basically told her she was going to, because he ended up having to close down his store, which wasn't doing very well. And he ended up in 1974 entering his father's business, the Durst organization, as his father had basically said to him, please don't make me go to my grave and you aren't in the family business. So in 1973, Durst and Kathie move back to New York. Durst goes into the family business. They also, pretty much immediately when they get back to New York, they end up getting married in a very straightforward ceremony that just at a random office building, and only Durst's father Seymour and Kathie's mother are the only witnesses apart from a priest and a rabbi. So we're going to jump forward to 1978, and Kathie and Durst are still living in New York. They also have a house in South Salem that they go to quite often. And at this stage, Kathie is accepted into the Albert Einstein School of Medicine to become a doctor, which I think is really admirable that she's married to this uber wealthy guy. And not only is she doing her own thing, she's been a dental hygienist, she became a nurse, but she's going to medical school, which is notoriously very difficult. So we're going to jump forward a little bit again to January 31st, 1982, which, as you remember from the beginning of this chapter, is where our story really begins, although the context and history that we just spoke about is important. But January 31st, 1982 is the beginning, because that was the last day that Kathie Durst was ever seen alive. So in 1982, Kathie and Robert Durst are living pretty much between three residences. They have a penthouse apartment in Manhattan, they have another apartment on Riverside Drive, and they have a house or a cottage on the lake in South Salem. As Durst was working for his family's company and Kathie was attending medical school in the Bronx, they spent their weekdays mainly in Manhattan, and then at the weekends they would go out to the suburbs, South Salem. And at this time, it's been widely reported for pretty much the past 40 years that people have been talking about this story, that they were going through a very difficult time in their relationship. Bob Durst was very abusive towards his wife. He was also physically abusive, and there is a lot of evidence of this. Her friends and family have spoken about her telling them, seeing her being dragged out of parties by like her hair and stuff. And she was also hospitalized at a hospital in the Bronx for injuries to her face that she didn't want to press charges for. While that's all true, there was a lot more going on, and this hasn't really been spoken about until very recently, but they were well into divorce proceedings at this time in January 1982. Durst had had many affairs throughout their marriage, and he actually at the time was dating Mia Farrow's sister, Prudence Farrow. And this weekend that was January 29th through 31st, Prudence had actually broken up with Durst over this weekend. And Kathie had seen all these affairs and they're going through with a divorce. So she had started a relationship of her own, allegedly with Jill Biden's first husband. So there's some random people involved in this story. So there's definitely some other random people throughout the rest of this. So they're going through the divorce, and Kathie asked for $250,000 to basically leave, and she didn't want anything else. He apparently, when she asked for this, said no and cut off all her credit cards. He took her off the bank accounts, all of them, and then he stopped paying her medical school tuition. She wanted this $250,000 to basically pay for the end of school and get set up with an apartment and stuff like that. And the medical school, she had one semester, the semester that started in January, that was it. And then she was done with school. So she was really close to being through everything. Durst, again, said no, and this weekend, the 29th through 31st, they had a massive fight, and they were staying at the cottage in South Salem. Kathie called her friend and said, I need to get out of here. I have to get away from him. She went over to her friend's house, and this was on the Sunday, the 31st. She ends up getting a phone call from Durst, and then she says to her friend, he's really mad. I need to go home. She gets in her car, drives home, and that was the last time that anyone else apart from Robert Durst saw Kathie Durst alive. So according to Durst, she came home and they had an argument. He admits it was a physical argument. And then he said he drove her to the train station. She got on the train. She got off the train. She's greeted into the apartment by the doorman. And then she goes up to the apartment, sleeps in the apartment. Then Monday morning, February 1st, she wakes up and apparently she is sick. She calls the dean of her medical school because she was supposed to go to a clerkship that morning. And in case you don't know, that is like the hands-on practical bit where you go to a hospital, go to whatever department you're supposed to be in, like pediatrics or surgery, and you work in the hospital basically. And it is a very important part. Like, you cannot move on basically or become a doctor if you don't do these clerkships. And as I said, it was her last semester. So the fact that she was calling in sick is incredibly strange because, I mean, pretty much anyone who's a doctor who's watching this was probably going to agree and say there's no way that unless you were literally on your deathbed that you would be calling in sick. And even the dean of the medical school, who it wasn't actually the dean that was familiar with her, it was a dean that had really only spoken to her like maybe once before. He said never has he had a student call in ill to a clerkship. So that's how kind of unusual it is. But after this phone call, no one ever sees or hears from Kathie ever again. And it wasn't until the 5th of February, the Friday, that Robert Durst finally reports his wife missing. And her friends were suspicious of this already because there was the friend that she had been to her house the Sunday, Gilberta, her name is. She was actually supposed to meet up with Kathie for lunch or dinner, and she never showed up, which wasn't like her at all. So Robert Durst goes to the police station and reports his wife missing. The police are very just uninterested pretty much and think, oh, she's just run off, like no big deal. And they don't really investigate or pretty much do anything. Durst basically tells the story that I've just told, and then also adds that when he went back to the South Salem house, he went out to walk his dog. He called Kathie from a payphone. She said she was back at the apartment. Then he saw his neighbor, had a drink with them, went to bed. That was it. And you will see now that pretty much none of this was true. Once the media found out that a member of the Durst family was missing, then everything erupted, and the media was constantly talking about the fact that Kathie Durst was missing. The Durst family originally put up a reward for $100,000, but then they took it down to $15,000, and no one from the Durst family said anything. And I don't mean like to the media, I mean they didn't even call Kathie's family. With the media firestorm erupting, Durst's friend Susan Berman steps in and becomes basically his spokesperson, and she speaks to the media. So this story that Durst told is pretty much all bullshit. He basically has created this completely fictitious account of that day. He didn't have a drink with his neighbor, and no one ever saw Kathie again after she went home to his house. So the media is told that the doorman saw her and that a phone call was placed by her to her medical school. That is not something that the police department would disclose to the media in an open investigation. So most people believe that the Durst family allegedly told the media this because obviously it takes some of the spotlight off of him, because this way people have seen and heard from her after she's gone home to him and they've had a fight. But there was actually a phone call placed. They could never find the doorman. They never got confirmation that anyone saw her arrive in Manhattan. They never got confirmation from anyone that she was on a train. And her friends went and rode that train constantly to see, people that would get on it frequently, and nobody ever saw her. But there was a phone call actually placed by a woman to the medical school. The dean who took the phone call wasn't familiar with Kathie Durst. He actually was just covering for another dean, and he'd maybe spoken to Kathie Durst once for 5 minutes. He definitely wasn't familiar with her voice. And obviously, if you're the dean of a school and someone calls and says, "Hi, I'm Kathie Durst, I'm calling out sick," you're gonna take them at their word. But we don't know it was Kathie Durst. We know it was a woman. We know it was probably a woman that was very close to Bob Durst, because to place the phone call, the woman would have to know exactly what was happening. She would have to know that Kathie Durst wasn't going to be seen again. So Robert Durst turned to his best friend, the unofficial spokeswoman, Susan Berman, to make this call and pretend to be Kathie Durst. And the fact that Susan Berman knew that Kathie Durst wasn't going to be seen again, and the fact that she knew Robert Durst's secrets, that got Susan Berman killed. Susan Berman was a writer, and she was the daughter of a Las Vegas mobster, and she actually wrote a book called Easy Street that was based a bit on her life and growing up in Las Vegas, but also how her family was intertwined with Las Vegas and places like the Flamingo Hotel. Most people believed that Susan Berman was the person who made the phone call pretending to be Kathie Durst, but up until recently, there really wasn't any evidence to support this. However, not too long ago, there was a recording that was discovered that was a phone call between Susan Berman and a crime reporter named Albert Goldman. This was recorded on the 10th of February, about 10 days after Kathie Durst went missing in 1982. In the phone call that was supposed to be off the record, Susan Berman basically goes through the different scenarios that could have happened when it comes to the disappearance of Kathie Durst. Many people who've heard this phone call, including friends and family and people involved in this case, the prosecutor in one of Durst's case, lawyers, the documentary filmmakers of the JINX, lots of people think that this phone call was Susan Berman basically going through a checklist of what could have happened to Kathie Durst and trying to relay some information to Albert Goldman in an unofficial capacity. Because while again it was off the record, she thought that this would be a way to kind of help protect Bob Durst a little bit. This phone call doesn't paint Susan Berman in a very good light. It does show a lot of twisting of facts, and she also says some pretty cruel things about Kathie Durst, and especially considering she was missing at this time, you can't really overlook that. But I do just bring it up as more supporting evidence for the theory that Susan Berman was the person who made this phone call. I will mention this much later on in the video as well, because it does kind of come back around a little bit, but for now, it just is a little bit of important context. Because the phone call didn't paint Susan in a good light, when these things have been brought to trial, they actually didn't use this phone call as evidence because they didn't want to basically show Susan in this bad light. But getting to trials and evidence, that is getting a bit ahead of ourselves. I want to go back to the year 2000, but I want to provide a little bit of context about Susan Berman as well. By 2000, Susan Berman was going through a really, really difficult time in her life, and she had moved back to Los Angeles from New York, and she was going through extreme financial hardship at this time, and she also was having difficulty getting any sort of writing job. She had gone back to LA initially to try and do screenwriting, and while she'd had some development deals at places like Showtime and other TV opportunities, none of them had really amounted to anything. When she initially went back, she was going to write the screenplay and make a movie of her book, Easy Street, about growing up in Las Vegas and her family, but this never came to fruition either. She was, however, paid over $350,000 for drafting the screenplay and working on it. And Susan Berman actually was very wealthy. She had a trust fund. And in the 90s, when she had gone back to LA and started doing screenwriting, she had her trust fund. You know, she was getting this $350,000 income, and she ended up getting a nice house in Beverly Hills and a convertible. And she actually ended up getting married. She got married to another writer, Mr. Margolis, who was 13 years younger than her, and they got married at the Bel-Air Hotel in a big lavish wedding, and Robert Durst actually walked her down the aisle. Unfortunately, after 7 months, Susan and her husband ended up splitting up because she said to friends that he was abusing substances, and she did want to reconcile after he got healthy again. But unfortunately, very soon after they broke up, he ended up passing away from an overdose. In the late 1980s, Susan began writing scripts with a financial advisor called Paul Kaufman, and he had 2 children, and Susan and he ended up moving in together, and Susan became a mother to his then teenagers, and for the rest of her life, those kids did see her as their other parent. And when Susan and Kaufman actually broke up, his kids ended up staying with Susan. But Susan and Kaufman initially, they started making this Broadway musical, and this was what caused Susan to lose all of her money, her trust fund, everything, even her house. And she put all of her money into this Broadway musical that never ended up coming to be. By the late 90s, Susan was in dire financial strait. She was living in a rented house, but the landlord wanted her out because of issues with the rent, and she had pretty much lost everything, and she wasn't getting any work. In the first quarter of 1999, Susan reached out to her old friend Robert Durst. They actually hadn't spoken since 1994, as when Robert Durst was passed over for the role of running the Durst organization, he ended up leaving the family business because his brother Douglas, which was the son after him, was picked to be the head of the company, and Robert Durst obviously wanted to be the one picked, and he also hated his brother, so he left the company, and when he did so, he cut off a lot of his friends and relationships, and that was when he and Susan stopped talking. But she was really desperate, and she spoke to friends about, should I reach out to Bob, and asked him for some help financially, and friends said that was kind of her only option. And when she reached out to Durst, he did end up helping her. He sent her 2 checks for $25,000 each in 2000. The second check was dated November 9th, 2000, And 2 days after this date was when Charles Bagley, who is a reporter for the New York Times, ended up breaking the story that the disappearance of Kathie Durst, even though it happened almost 20 years ago, that case was being reopened in Westchester by the new district attorney, Jeanine Pirro. Durst seemingly panics when he hears about this investigation being reopened, and he immediately goes and rents an apartment in Galveston, Texas, the one that we spoke about at the beginning of this story, which is what we'll pick up in just a minute. Durst actually found out about this investigation on October 31st, 11 days before it broke in the New York Times, because he was tipped off by his sister Wendy, because there was some discussions with Jeanine Pirro and members of the Durst family, allegedly. Sometime between November 11th and December 23rd, 2000, Susan Berman and Robert Durst speak, and Susan Berman tells Durst that she has been contacted by the New York police and they want to speak to her about the disappearance of Kathie Durst. A decade and a half after Susan Berman told Durst that the police wanted to speak to her, Durst actually found out that that wasn't true. Susan Berman was never contacted by the police, and many people believe she told Durst she was to try and put pressure on him to help her more financially, because she knew his secrets, because she knew about Kathie Durst through making the phone call. So some very significant things happen after Susan tells Durst that the police want to speak to her, although that's not true. Durst ends up, as I said, renting the apartment in Galveston, Texas. He then goes back to New York and he ends up marrying his second wife, Debrah Charatan. She actually had been dating Durst since 1990. They did have a romantic relationship in the very beginning, but they absolutely were not romantic from pretty much like 1992 onwards. But they did end up getting married. It's a very straightforward paperwork wedding, but Debrah Charatan is not only his wife legally and given all the rights and everything with that, which include spousal immunity, where you do not have to testify against your spouse, but she is also given, a lot of financial help. She is helped with her previous divorce and her custody agreement. She is also given a absolute fuckload of money and her dream apartment on Fifth Avenue, this insane 20 million house in the Hamptons, which massive, huge flag. You will not believe how that becomes relevant later. So huge, enormous pin in that. And she also just, enters this amazing life. She was involved in real estate herself. She had this first ever female real estate company, but she actually went bankrupt. So she really hit the jackpot when she married Durst. I mean, financially anyway. There's a lot more to it. But she is married to Durst on December 11th, 2000. She's also the person who is going to be his heir too. So she's going to inherit the trust, everything. And 8 days after marrying his new wife, he ends up on December 19th flying to Northern California. On Christmas Eve, the police are called to do a wellness check on Susan Berman at her house at Benedict Canyon because her door is ajar and also her dogs are out. And someone had found her dogs, one of her neighbors, and they left like a note on her door saying, "Oh, I found your dog." And they tried to call her, messages on her machine. People hadn't heard from her. And when they saw the door ajar, they called the police. The police enter Susan's house and they find her deceased on the ground with a bullet hole in the back of her head where she had been killed execution style. The police end up seeing on the walls that Susan had her father's mugshot framed. They see some of the Las Vegas mobster memorabilia and they end up thinking this is some sort of mob hit. So the crime scene isn't really treated the way it should be. They didn't take fingerprints. They didn't, do blood spatter and everything like that. So they think it is a mob hit when Obviously, it is not. And there are 3 suspects in Susan Berman's murder. One of them was her manager, one of them was her former partner, Kaufman, and the other one was Robert Durst. There is one more very, very, very important thing I have to mention, a piece of evidence that is one of the 2 most important pieces of evidence in this entire story. The thing that I probably wouldn't be sitting here telling you this story without this. So the other one we'll talk about in a second. But this one was a letter that was delivered to the Beverly Hills Police Department a few days after Susan's life was taken. The Beverly Hills Police Department get a white envelope, the same envelope most letters are sent in, and there is the address written in block letters on the front of the envelope. However, the word Beverly is spelt wrong. There is an extra E in it. So the things that we know about this letter, it was obviously written by the killer, and obviously the killer cared in some way about Susan Berman because they didn't want her not to be found or her to be found after a significant time. So this letter is a very important piece of evidence, and it gets a lot more important in just a minute. So in less than 7 weeks, the disappearance of Kathie Durst investigation is reopened. Robert Durst finds out about it and goes and rents a shithole of an apartment in Galveston, Texas. He then marries his second wife, Debrah Sheridan, and makes her his heir. She gets a lot of financial benefit and compensation. She also cannot testify against him. And then Susan Berman's life is taken, and is taken by someone who cares about her because they write a note to the police. And 9 months after that, Morris Black's life is taken in Galveston, Texas. And we're right back at the beginning of the video. But now you have all the important backstory and context to get into the really, really wild and unbelievable part of this story. Sorry, G is in a huff right now because I won't go in the kitchen and she wants me to go in there and give her more TREATS's, and she's already had quite a lot of those today. So I've told her after I finish filming this part of the video she can have some more, but she's trying to manipulate me right now to go in the kitchen. So sorry if she's like running around the background. So when Robert Durst was arrested for taking the life of Morris Black, there was a huge amount of evidence, and the case was really being described as a slam dunk because the evidence was so overwhelming. And Durst actually went and hired this dream team of lawyers because he had pretty much unlimited resources. So as we spoke about in the very beginning of the video, Durst posted bail for $250,000, and he literally has been quoted as saying, "Oh yeah, they shouldn't have given me bail because I just saw it as, buy $250,000, I'm free, I'm out of here." And he went on the run, and he actually ended up being caught in Pennsylvania because he went into a grocery store and shoplifted a $6 sandwich. So he got caught, and he'd shaved his head, shaved his eyebrows, and he had actually rented a car with Morris Black's ID. So when he was arrested, obviously he was brought back to Texas, and this was when he started assembling his dream team of lawyers that was led by Dick DeGuerin, who is a pretty famous and well-known criminal defense attorney. So for this trial, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of minute detail because there is just so much more to get to, but we're obviously going to go over the basics, and the main thing is the outcome. Because the evidence was so overwhelming for this trial, Durst pretty much had to take the stand, because how are you going to explain otherwise what this situation was with it being such overwhelming evidence. This trial as a whole had a lot of glaring issues. Even myself, when I was looking into this and researching it, there were some things that I even thought, wow, why was that not asked or mentioned? And I'm going to be a little bit graphic here, so if you're squeamish, then I'll put a timestamp on the screen to skip forward to. But there wasn't even a question asked about what Durst did with Morris Black's head, because he obviously, as I said in the beginning of the video, he was dismembered and then he was put in different bags. He had obviously, Durst had come back to the bay. He saw, oh, they're not sinking, shit. So each of the bags had like slits in them because he'd obviously looked to see where is the head, and the head was never, ever, ever found. And nobody even asked him, what did you do with it? Because Durst's defense was that he and Morris Black basically got into a scuffle, and Black had Durst's revolver, and when they were fighting, Durst basically said he tried to take the revolver off him and it went off, and it ended up going off and going through the back of his head. So if they were able to find the head, they'd be able to know, oh, this wasn't what he said it was. You know, you obviously, everybody knows like CSI and everything is so prevalent now. They can tell the angle of the gun, like what was happening, whether Durst's story was true. So the fact that this key piece of evidence wasn't even asked about, I mean, that's like a huge issue. So that was his defense, that he had got into a fight. It was an accident. And of course, it's Texas. So it's a stand your ground state, which, in case anybody is outside the US, I do have primarily US viewers, but you know, you have a right to defend yourself. I lived most of my life in Florida, and it's the same there. If somebody steps one foot in your property and you feel threatened, you have the right to defend yourself. And that is basically the defense that they went with. And because that was the defense and they needed to explain all of that, they had to put Durst on the stand. And so he basically went on the stand and said, I got into this fight and the revolver went off. I didn't mean to actually take his life, but yeah, I did dismember him. And you won't believe this, but he was found not guilty. As I said, the missing part of the body was the key bit that they couldn't prove that that wasn't what happened, what Durst said. So when they actually announced that he was found not guilty, he does this massive like sigh of relief, but he actually even says to his attorney, did they say not guilty? Like, are you sure they said not guilty? And he asks like a couple of times because even he didn't believe that he was found not guilty. But it gets even more bizarre with this trial, because not only does the judge become relevant in a second again, one of the jury members becomes extremely relevant for more of Durst's crimes. So although Durst was found not guilty on the charge of taking Morris Black to life, he was found guilty of tampering with a body, and he obviously for jumping bail. So he was sentenced to some time in prison, but the vast majority of it he had already served, waiting to go on trial. So he only ended up having to serve until July 2005. He was released from federal prison then, and of course he had to go on parole. But he ended up being arrested just 5 months later in December 2005 because he left this area that he was supposed to stay in, and he went to a mall, and unbelievably, he bumped into the judge from his trial. And obviously she was like, what the fuck are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. And so he then violated his parole and had to go back into prison. So after his little trip to the Houston Mall, while Durst is in prison, he actually ends up settling this case that he'd had with basically his entire Durst family, because they were having issues with the money and the trust, and because he pretty much had removed himself from the family and the business. So they end up settling with him, the family and the trust, and he ends up getting $60 million on top of obviously all the other money that he already had, because the trust was like paying him out $1 million a year when he was like in university and stuff. And then obviously over the years he was getting paid way more. So taking everything into account, he ends up being worth about $100 million after this settlement. February 28th, 2006, Durst is released from prison, and 9 months later, his parole finishes and he's pretty much free, done, no more issues going on, and he is a free man. And I really want to highlight that, because now we're going to discuss the absolute insanity that caused him to not become a free man. And it is one of the wildest stories, and definitely one of the probably biggest true crime moments because of the whole context surrounding it. So in 2010, a movie comes out called All Good Things. And if you remember right back to the beginning of this story, that was the name of Durst's store that he had in Vermont when he was married to Kathie Durst, before he went and worked for his family's company. So the movie starred Ryan Gosling as Robert Durst, which how did he luck out getting Ryan Gosling in that role? And Kirsten Dunst played his first wife, Kathie. And there's also a lot of other people in this movie who were more in the beginning stages of their career at this time. Like Nick Offerman's in it, Kristen Wiig is in it. When this movie was coming out, it actually had gone through a lot of issues. It originally was supposed to go out through the Weinstein Company, and you know, we're mentioning everyone in this video because there is actually a Jeffrey connection with the people involved in this movie and stuff that we'll talk about in a minute. So Durst actually finds out about this movie before it comes out, and he ends up calling up the director, producer, and the guy that's at the center of kind of any sort of Robert Durst media, and that's Andrew Jarecki. He also was the director, producer, writer of the JINX, which we'll also talk about in a second. And Andrew Jarecki was actually the founder of Moviefone with his dad. His dad is a very, very famous, well-known Yale psychiatrist, and he also will talk about some stuff with him later too. Jarecki is also the person who put out Capturing the Friedmans, and he was involved in Catfish from MTV. He also wrote the music for Felicity with J.J. Abrams, so there's a lot of random little things going on there. But a little bit more on him, his dad, and some other stuff that hasn't been really talked about a lot later in the video. So they end up having this phone call, Jarecki and Durst gets this special screening set up for him to see All Good Things. And he ends up then calling Jarecki after that and saying that he really liked the movie, even though the movie really portrays him as taking the lives of his first wife, Susan Berman, his best friend, and Morris Black. And there's a lot of other things that don't make him look good at all, but he said he thought it was the most accurate thing out there about him and his life. And because they were looking for something to enhance the DVD sales, and because it was an interesting opportunity, Durst basically said, "Do you want to interview me?" Because Durst had actually tried to put in like a donation to this cooperative, and they had ended up calling him and saying, "Yeah, we want to accept your donation, but would you put it in anonymously, because we don't really want to be associated with you in name." And he was also having some issues trying to get apartments, and the media really, around the Morris Black trial, there was a lot of media, you know, even just going down to Texas, and he was on a lot of newspaper and magazines and everything like that, just randomly when people would see him out and about in New York, because he had obviously this trail of taking people's lives or people passing away around him. So he was like a bit of a media fodder, and he really wanted to put his side out.
What made you do the movie? Do the commentary and talk to Mark and Andrew? I don't get it. What made you talk to them?
It's still sort of putting that together in my own mind. I was approached by Connie Chung, and they wanted to do something like had come out with Mike Tyson, where there was all this bad stuff about him, and he was actually really a good guy.
Okay.
And they wanted to do that with me, and I never felt like that. I never felt that I was really a good guy.
I cannot think of a decision that he must regret more than this phone call saying, let's do an interview. In the beginning, they actually end up doing like a DVD commentary, and that is on the DVD for All Good Things. But then they decide to do this interview. And because Jarecki and then also his producing partner at the time, I do believe they've had like a falling out, because he didn't produce or was really involved in the second season of the JINX. And I did see people talking about it online, but I wasn't ever able to get anything concrete. So allegedly they've had a falling out, his producing partner, Mark Smerling. And then there was another producer involved, especially in the second season, Zach Stewart Pontier. So they basically, the three of them, and obviously like they have a huge team, they were researching and figuring out the life of Robert Durst. So they'd had all these years of research by the time they sat down for an interview with Robert Durst, and they were pretty much given free rein to ask him whatever they wanted. So Durst and Jarecki have this interview in 2010. Durst admits to a lot of things that he had never really spoken about, because he'd never done any major like interview or prolonged interview. And this interview went on for hours and hours. I think it was over 12 hours. And he ends up admitting to things like lying to the police when Kathie Durst went missing and a bunch of other stuff. And they do ask him about Susan Berman and Morris Black and about moving to Texas and, you know, living as a woman and what was going on. And he basically said he didn't want to be Robert Durst anymore. There are a lot of things that you can see him making it up as he goes along, and there's a lot of things that he will say, like he tells a story about his mother, and then obviously there's other people contradicting what he has said. But there is a really key moment that happens, and they, out of this interview, end up making the docuseries The JINX. And The JINX was on HBO. It was a 6-episode series, and it has probably one of the most talked about and insane endings, or well, just moments ever for television. And they ended up winning 2 Emmys and a Peabody and everything. And at the time when it came out in 2015, it was extremely talked about. And you'll also see why it was even more talked about in a second. So this key moment that happens in the earlier parts of the JINX is that they're interviewing, they're talking, and instead of cutting to the next scene, the camera like pulls back a little bit and he's sitting in the chair and they're just like, oh, will we take a break? Will we take a break? Sure. And Durst is sitting there. He like takes a little paper cup of water and he's drinking it. And he's been asked a difficult question at this time, and he's kind of rehearsing the answer in his head. And you see him saying like, oh, I did not knowingly lie. I did not knowingly lie. And his lawyer comes over and says, you're still mic'd. We can hear everything you're saying. And he has, you know, one of these little tiny mics that has the little wire on it. And, you know, if you have it clipped on there, like I've definitely, if I've been out filming something, you know, it's easy to forget, but especially if I was, you know, talking about the lives that I'd taken or the disappearance of my wife, I would be pretty conscious of having a mic on.
Just hear every word you said.
What? Oh, I was reviewing it.
Everything up.
I hear what you're saying.
So that's it. That little scene, huge major flag for in the mind. You've probably got like 50 flags at the moment in your mind, but they carry on with the rest of the series, and it's not mentioned again until the very, very, very end. And you almost forget about this little mic moment because, of course, when you see something like that in this highly produced, polished series, you're like, why are they showing this to me? It must mean something. So they end up finding this other huge significant thing that ends up kind of putting that to the back of your mind. So what is it they find? Basically, if you remember back to one of your flags, there was an envelope sent to the Beverly Hills Police Department by the person who took Susan Berman's life. And it was a white envelope with block letters with Beverly Hills Police Department, Beverly Hills, 90210. And inside there was the little note with Susan Berman's address, Benedict Canyon, and cadaver. And it's all handwritten block letters. So they end up speaking to Susan Berman's son, who is the son of the Kaufman guy that she ended up losing all her money in that musical. And we'll talk about the son a little bit later too, because he has had a lot of issues with the way the series turned out, and he's been speaking a lot online about a lot of the contradictions, and a lot of the problems that he has are surrounding this that we're talking about now, this letter situation. And he basically ends up calling Jarecki and the Jinx team and says, I found something. I really need you to come over and see it because I'm kind of freaking out and I don't know whether it means what I think it means. He'd actually had like a bit of a relationship with Durst after Susan had passed away. Durst had given him $25,000 4 times over for going to school, so it's supposed to be like $25,000 a year, and they'd had dinner a lot and things like that. And the team goes over to Sarab's, that's Susan Berman's son's name, and he ends up showing them an envelope from Robert Durst to Susan Berman. The envelope contained, again, a flag, one of the checks that Durst had sent Susan when she was going through her financial difficulties. It was the check that she received 1 month before her life was taken. And the envelope is identical to the envelope that contained the note the killer had written that said cadaver on it. I do want to add here that Susan Berman's son did say that the police did have an identical envelope that obviously another check or a letter had been sent in from Robert Durst to Susan Berman that had identical handwriting and looked exactly the same. He said that they had a copy of this envelope in their possession from 2003 onwards. Obviously, I can't confirm that, but her son has been speaking a lot on the JINX Reddit, and I of course will link that below in case you've never seen any of my videos before. I always link all of my sources, and there are so many for this video, in the description box and in the comments. And I'm also just going to throw in there, I don't do any sponsorships on this channel, so if you enjoy the video or want to support us, a subscribe would really mean a lot to Miss G and I, but absolutely no pressure. And if you really enjoy the content, feel free to check out my Patreon for free or as a paid member, and I will stop plugging now. But the envelope that the son ends up showing to Jarecki and Mark Snurling and Zach Stewart Pontier, they end up taking the envelope from the son. He said that he really didn't want to give it to them, but at the time he felt okay about it after they kind of spoke to him about it. And what they end up doing is they end up putting it in a safety deposit box. And again, this is what the son has said, that when they did that, when they discovered this new evidence and put it in that safety deposit box, it basically started a 2-year timer. And that 2 years was the time that they, Susan Berman's kids and relatives, would have been able to go after Durst for wrongful death and get some sort of financial compensation for the fact that he took the life of Susan Berman. And I bring that up because they didn't end up bringing the envelope to the police until sometime after May 2012. And the filmmakers of the JINX, that all of this is happening because they are filming this docuseries, they have been incredibly weird about the timeline. And there's also some things that I'll point out in the later chapter about how they kind of, I hate saying the word manipulate because it sounds like really bad, but they really did mess around with the timeline. And there's some other things that they did that, listen, like everybody edits, everybody, it's a TV show at the end of the day, but just because this got so serious, and you'll see also how serious in a second, I don't know, some of it is a little bit questionable. Basically, they end up doing a second interview with Durst where they confront him and show him the envelope before they go to the police. And what they ended up doing to kind of like cover their back a little bit was they hired like a lawyer to advise them around all of the legalities with the documentary. And they're all incredibly wealthy people. Like I said, Andrew Jarecki, the reason he became interested in Durst is because he grew up in the same area where Durst is from. Like his family is incredibly wealthy. They've worked on this for basically 20 years at this stage. To be able to just work on one project for 20 years is, that not a lot of people can do that. So he ends up reaching out to their lawyer to advise them, and the lawyer they hire is actually Marcia Clark, who was the prosecutor in the O.J. Simpson trial. And she says to them, and there's a recording of this, I'll put a clip in.
Somebody comes to you and says, this is what we got, and then we show you this handwriting stuff. Are you prepared to take on the case?
I'm pretty damn close. Pretty close. I mean, I was a cowboy before Simpson.
Marcia knows firsthand what it's like to go up against a wealthy defendant with an expensive legal team. And she says it's not a slam dunk, because the main piece of evidence in this case is unusual.
The cadaver note is it's weird because it's a little bit cryptic. It's not a confession. We know what that is, but it can be very compelling when you look at it like that. When you start to dissect it the way the defense will do, and first of all, you attack the note. If you can, you say, you can't even prove it's his writing. That's the best. And they may start with that as a fallback. You don't even need to put him on the stand. You could say, what the hell does it mean?
She says that it would be really good if they confronted him on camera because they would be able to get, obviously, his reaction, but also because they are filmmakers and they're not the police, they just get this clean, we're showing it to him and this is how he reacts. Whereas if it was police or any sort of law enforcement lawyers, they would have to advise him of Miranda rights before they showed it to him or spoke to him about it. Obviously, if they're doing that's going to put his back up and he's going to be thinking, why are they doing that? Why are they advising me of this? So that is their justification for holding on to it for so long. So I would love to know people's opinion about that in the comments, and a lot of the other stuff that we're going to talk about. I'm really interested to hear what people have to say. So flash forward to April 2012, April 18th, and this is where they're going to do the second interview and confront Durst with the envelope. And this happens just at a hotel. This interview is the last episode of the JINX, episode 6. And you can even see how differently they shot this episode. The first 5 episodes are very highly polished, color corrected, beautiful B-roll, really nice editing. Everything is sleek and very HBO. But the last episode is very reminiscent of bedroom YouTuber, this sort of style or even not even this sort of style, more out in the world, it looks like it's all handheld and it's, a little bit shaky and weird angles and, they're talking to the camera, but you can see they're holding it and things. So it's looking to kind of build in that more authenticity and realness, because they really mess with the timeline in this last episode. Like, they do not make it clear that there was 2 years pretty much between the first interview with Durst and the second interview. They do say like, he was giving us the runaround for a while, but 2 years is a long time. And they also do this, I don't want to say manipulative again, but it's just, they mess around a lot with the timeline. So in the episode, they make it seem like, he's gone to Spain, he's going to talk to us when he comes back, and then he cancels again and rearranges again. And then they film in their office again, like this handheld style, and they're like, Bob's been arrested. And they go over these arrests that have happened to him, one for trespassing at his brother's house because his siblings have all these orders against him not being near them or near their property or kids or anything. And then they also talk about he gets charged with public urination for peeing on a candy rack at a CVS. And the way that they present this, it's these arrests happen before their second interview. But really, their second interview happened, again, April 18th, 2012. And the arrest for his brother for trespassing at his brother's house was August 16th, 2013. So there was like a year and, a quarter, third between these times. And the urination arrest was in July 2014. Just to clarify the timeline, Durst's first interview where he's wearing the gray cashmere sweater, that was the first interview shot in California in 2010. He then has 2 years pass, and the second interview is filmed April 2012. That day is also the day that all of the B-roll is shot, where Durst is in Times Square, Durst is at his brother's house, and they're like in that Starbucks and everything. He's wearing the white Oxford shirt with the blazer. And then a year and a couple of months later, in August 2013, Durst is arrested for what he did that day of the second interview, where he went to his brother's house. So in the Jinx, they presented as though they had the arrest in between the two interviews, and the reason they could get the second interview is because they gave Durst's lawyers the raw footage from that day where he was outside his brother's house, but they shot that footage on the same day as the second interview. So unless they have a time machine, that is not possible. But there's a lot of articles and interviews and timeline breakdowns below that goes down every single thing in the sources if you want to know a lot more about it. When they actually do get him to the hotel, they're still doing this authentic, real editing, and he sits down. They confront him with the envelope, and he starts having like a reaction, basically, where he does do this blinking thing a lot, but he starts basically burping a lot, and he's trying to just be like, they're block letters, how else would a block letter look? And they don't push him too hard about the envelope. And he asks them about like a picture that's on the desk, and pretty much that's it. They don't really get too much out of him. If you're watching him, it's clear that he's having like a reaction to this. It doesn't look good. I mean, even looking at the envelopes, like that doesn't look good.
Is the same, so I can see the conclusion the cops would draw, or the writing exemplar person would conclude they were both written by the same person.
So they seem to be wrapping up, and in a similar way that they did, the little mic thing before, they basically where they would normally cut, the camera continues to roll, and you see Bob like basically being like, oh, okay, are we done? And you hear, I think it was Zach in the background saying, oh, do you want to take one of these sandwiches, Bob? Because as I spoke about earlier, he's like notoriously like a cheapskate. He's like, yeah, I'll take one of these sandwiches. And he says he wants to use the restroom before he goes. And so he goes into the restroom, and not realizing that he still has his mic on, he starts talking to himself. And the other wild thing about this is that they did not discover this audio, allegedly, until 2014. So this, what I'm about to tell you, sat as like raw audio just on, I'm sure, like a like a hard drive or a computer for 2 years pretty much. And when he goes into the bathroom, I'm basically gonna play you just the clip of what was in the JINX.
Or maybe this is the bathroom.
Yeah, that's...
You're right. There it is. You're caught. Well, what's in the house? What the hell did I do? Kill them all. Of course.
So obviously, hearing that created an absolute fire fucking storm. The media, it was everywhere. Everyone was talking about it.
Of course, I killed them all.
Shocking finale of HBO's documentary series, The Jinxed. This doesn't happen in real life, right? You wouldn't believe this if it were fictionalized.
Robert Durst said he killed them all.
Real estate heir Robert Durst admitting to, quote, killing them all.
Killed them all. Them all.
The 5 words everyone is talking about this week: kill them all, of course. Is it possible that when he uttered those words, Robert Durst was confessing to 3 murders? And could the list be even longer?
Also, a massive, huge thing happened the day before it aired, as in Robert Durst was arrested for taking the life of Susan Berman. It was talked about massively, and I will straight off the bat say, though, they did manipulate this recording of him with the audio. He did say all those things, but it was out of order, and there was a lot more words in between. Going into the bathroom and straight away saying, there it is, you're caught. I mean, come on. Pretty much it is a confession. This is one of the things that it is kind of that moral question, and I'm so interested to hear what people think about this, because it's just fascinating to me to hear everybody's different opinions, because I understand everybody edits. Like, obviously I edit these videos immensely. Like, it wouldn't be interesting if I was just sitting here without any editing, and I'm not in any way comparing myself to the JINX. I haven't drank my own Kool-Aid. I'm not a delusional YouTuber. I know that I am making videos alone in my house with my cat, and I'm not saying anything similar to the JINX, because I know some people, get a bit carried away with what their content is. However, I absolutely adore YouTube, and I think YouTube is the future. More people watch YouTube than any other streaming platform, and there is some amazing content. I know I've mentioned her before, but Jenny Nicholson's new video was just in Vanity fucking Fair for best things to watch on TV so far in 2024. I mean, that's fucking amazing. But my point was just that I am not saying that I'm any comparable in any way, but I do understand you present the story in a certain way and you edit because you want people to watch and you want to keep people engaged. But I think when it is literally someone confessing to a crime, is it right to edit and rearrange those things? I'm really interested to hear what people think about this, because it was a very, very hot topic. And even now, because again, there's the JINX season 2 that just came out, so it reignited a lot of the conversation around it. But Robert Durst, he is arrested in New Orleans.
Tonight, Robert Durst is behind bars, arrested overnight in the lobby of a New Orleans hotel.
Durst was arrested on Saturday, the day before the shocking finale of that documentary series.
Authorities arrested Robert Durst in New Orleans Saturday on a Los Angeles County warrant.
And what ended up happening is when the JINX started airing, he pretty much was like, fuck. they're gonna, like, something's gonna happen from this. And he again went on the run. But the reason that they were able to arrest him is because, as I said before, they did end up giving the letter and the envelope to the police. So they were able to start their investigation in 2013, and the Jinx didn't air until February 2015. So apparently it was just like a coincidence that he ended up being arrested the day before the finale, and there was a lot of conversation about that too. But he was watching the episodes every week as they aired, and he was talking to Charles Bagley, who I mentioned him earlier. He's a reporter at the New York Times. He's done so many great articles on Durst. There's a lot listed in the sources. They basically would have like a little chat after every episode, and Charles Bagley said that the first couple of weeks he was like, oh yeah, it's nothing kind of crazy, like everything seems fine. And then around episode 4 he seemed to be a bit like, uh-oh, he's already talked about all of the people and all of the crimes, so what else are they going to cover? And then once episode 5 happened, he was really like, oh fuck, I need to get out of here because they're going to come arrest me. And so he ends up leaving his apartment in Texas. You won't believe the person who was helping him, allegedly. I mean, there's recorded evidence of it. But the juror from the first trial, from the trial of Morris Black, one of the jurors from that case ended up working for Durst, and his wife ended up working for Durst too. And they ended up going into his apartment the day after he left, and they went in with like all these beach bags and then left with them all full. So most people believe they were getting rid of whatever they needed to get rid of. And while Durst was in prison, he ended up sending them a check for $200,000. And when he's been asked about it, the juror, obviously he's just been like, oh, he just wanted to send it to me. And you're going to see this pattern a lot while we go over the rest of what happened after his arrest. So he's arrested in the Marriott in New Orleans, and what ended up getting him caught was that he ended up calling his voicemail, and the FBI had tapped his phone, and when he was trying to like get into his voicemail, it was not working properly, or he was like doing something wrong, and he started like swearing, and so they heard it was him, and then they traced the phone that he was using. And when they got to the hotel, they obviously said, oh, is Robert Durst staying here? And they were like, no. And they basically turned around, and he ended up walking in. And when they went to arrest him, this woman that was just in the lobby was like, oh, is that Robert Durst? Because she'd been watching the Jinx. And the name that he was using at the hotel was Everett Wart, who was one of the people from the Morris Black trial that when he had been caught and he was caught with that bone saw, they ended up checking with like Home Depot or wherever he bought it from, and there was 2 bone saws bought on that day, and the other person who bought the other bone saw was Everett Wart. Why would you use a name that's like tied to you? That I mean, that's the least of the dumb things he does. So he ends up having to deal with some of the issues in Louisiana because he had like a firearm on him and stuff. And he then ends up getting extradited to California in 2016. So he's pretty much in New Orleans for a year. And they have all of these phone calls of him basically calling people, and he was trying to assemble his Avengers of people to protect him and his friends and basically see which ones would stay on his side. And as the prosecutor from the case says,
it turns out that when you have a whole lot of money, people are willing to do things for you because they think some of that money might go their way.
And I cannot tell you how relevant that quote ends up being, especially who it comes from. Because the prosecutor in the Susan Berman case, the man who says this quote, he ends up doing something after the trial that I had to find multiple sources, because when I first read it, I truly didn't believe it. We're in the end zone now. So Robert Durst is in California. He's in prison. He's not brought to trial until 2020, March 2020. And I'm sure you can guess what happened. They start the case on the 4th of March. And after a few weeks, they are put on hold due to COVID. The trial doesn't actually resume until May 17th, 2021. So they get back into the swing of things, and they ended up calling an enormous amount of witnesses, and the witnesses end up being quite a key piece of the trial because there wasn't really tons and tons of evidence outside of the envelope, and of course they used the raw audio from that bathroom, him talking to himself. They didn't use anything from the JINX, they just used the raw footage, and they used, you know, him saying that he lied to the police and a bunch of other things in the actual trial. Durst used the same lead lawyer that he used when he got off in Texas, Dick DeGaran, and they also brought in this famous Las Vegas lawyer who's known for getting a lot of celebrities out of trouble. His name is David Chessoff, and they obviously had other people on the team as well, and they were being paid millions and millions and millions of dollars, 8 figures, around 12 million. And they didn't really seem to have that same slickness and astuteness that they had in Texas. And there was just a lot of silly mistakes and like even mixing up names and saying that his client did kill someone, and there was lots of issues, and people had a lot of complaints about the team, the defense team, and they even had some issues with the peculiarities of California law because they weren't super familiar with it. But because Durst had got himself in this web of a situation, and because talking on the stand had kind of gotten him out of what happened in Texas, he did actually go on the stand himself, and it was an absolute disaster. He ended up testifying for 2 weeks straight, and he had 9 days of cross-examination from the prosecution, and it was just lie after lie after lie that was so easy to disprove. Things like he would tell a story to, you know, his lawyers, the defense team, and he would say things like, you know, because they're trying to humanize him and talk about his childhood and, you know, pulling at any heartstrings they can. And they would say things like, oh, well, tell us about your relationship with your parents. And he would go on this whole thing about, oh, well, when I was younger, you know, it was always Mummy and Bobby and Daddy and Douglas. And, you know, we would play Uno and when we would play Frisbee. And the prosecution would just be able to come in and say, the Frisbee wasn't invented until 1968 and Uno wasn't invented until 1971. And you were born in 1943. So you're talking about like the late 40s, maybe early 50s, but that doesn't make any sense. So there was a lot of things like that they caught him in lies. And they even point blank asked him, if you had done this crime, if you had taken the life of Susan Berman, would you lie about it? And he just said yes. And then they asked him if he had lied on the stand, if he'd committed perjury. And he said, yeah, about 5 times. So it just was an absolute disaster. And his health was really, really failing by this time too. And they had to have like a tablet with him to have all the writing on it because he couldn't really hear anything. And it just, there was a lot of issues, and because it was obviously all televised too and online, you know, people really got a front row seat to absolutely everything that was happening. There were obviously a lot of factors that went into this trial and the result of guilty or not guilty, but the main point that the prosecution was trying to get across was that Durst had taken the life of his first wife. Durst took the life of Susan Berman because she knew that he had taken the life of Kathie Durst because she had made the phone call for him to the medical school, and because she was in this terrible financial situation, she had told him, the police want to speak to me, which he believed for 15 years until when he was arrested in New Orleans. The prosecutor from the Susan Berman case said to him, nobody contacted her. She lied to you about that. And you can see this recorded, this whole thing was recorded, and you see him react to it like surprised. So they basically, the whole case hinged on him taking the life of Kathie Durst too. And because that was being proven in this trial, then that was going to allow Kathie Durst's family to go ahead and go after him money-wise, because like with the envelope, it was a new piece of evidence that allowed them to exercise this option. So we will go back to that again in our section about all of the things that have come out since or haven't been talked about. And then we also have two witnesses and things that happen with them on the stand that I think were also the biggest factors in the result of the trial, because obviously the envelope and the recording in the bathroom, all of that is super, super important that we've already talked about. But there was so many people, I think there was over 200 witnesses for this trial, and a lot of Durst's friends would not turn against him. And especially, you know, like I said before with that juror, when you're giving people hundreds of thousands of dollars, that sways some people. And it's interesting if you watch season 2 of the JINX as well, because the first season is obviously all about Durst and his crimes, but season 2 is more about Durst's trial, but also the people that helped and enabled him. And I also think it's really interesting looking at that and then looking at the things that we're going to discuss in this next bit. We're really going to wrap the trial up here now, because there are so many things that I'm going to talk about that they also in maybe like very, very fringe ways, but some of these things are morally questionable. And that is kind of what they're talking about in season 2. Like, if you had a friend who is committing these heinous crimes, but you are benefiting and getting hundreds of thousands of dollars from them, you know, you would like to think that you're the sort of person who's going to say, no, like, you are literally taking the lives of people and cut them off and have nothing to do with them. But as you'll see with Durst, that absolutely was not the case. The vast majority of people stood by him, but there was one person who accidentally turned against him, and then there was one person who did turn against him. So the first person that I'm going to talk about is, he has this friend from high school, Stuart Altman. I mentioned him way back like 10 years ago at the beginning of the video. And he was the person who introduced him to his first wife. And Stuart is a lawyer. So they tried to basically say, oh, you can't use him as a witness because he's his lawyer and it's all privileged. And they used all the recorded prison calls where they're not talking about anything about the case. It's all, they're talking about like what to watch on TV. So he ended up having to testify. And also his wife did. And his wife, Emily, she accidentally confirmed that Durst was in Los Angeles when Susan Berman was killed, because he had flown into Northern California and no one was ever able to confirm that he was in LA. And she accidentally confirmed that he was on the stand. And then the other witness that really played a big part was one of his best friends, Nick Chavin. And Nick was Susan and Durst's, like it was the three of them that were super, super close friends. Durst also gave Nick Chavin this like multi-million-dollar advertising deal with his family's company that launched his career. So he says like multiple times, like, I really felt like I owed Bob a lot, like I couldn't repay that debt. But his wife was always really, really creeped out by Robert Durst and always thought that he was responsible for Susan Berman, and she just like didn't like him at all. And there was a dinner that Durst and Nick Chavin had together not that long ago from when he was arrested, and at the end of the meal, Durst basically said to Nick Chavin, like, sorry about Susan, but it was her or me. And they didn't discuss it anymore. There was no more clarification. But Nick told his wife, and then when the case was happening, his wife told the prosecutor from the case, and then the wife had to work on Nick a lot, but he ended up testifying to this on the stand. So all of those factors, the envelope, the audio, Nick testifying, Emily accidentally testifying, and Durst's terrible testimony, a zillion other things, all of that led the jury to finding Robert Durst guilty of taking the life of Susan Berman. Yet another bizarre twist in this case is the fact that when Durst was found guilty, he didn't actually know he was found guilty, and he didn't find out he was found guilty until the very next day, because he ended up contracting COVID and his lawyers immediately left LA and didn't tell him. The person who ended up telling him was the lawyer that Debrah Charatan, Durst's wife, ended up hiring. He's a criminal defense attorney, and he ended up going to the case every single day and sitting there. Debrah Charatan never ended up going to one day of court, so her lawyer ended up going to the prison and telling Durst that he'd been convicted. When they convicted him, they did also include the special circumstance that he had taken Susan Berman's life because she was a witness and might have revealed what he had done to his wife. So Durst is found guilty on September 17th, 2021, and on October 14th, 2021, he is convicted to life without the possibility of parole. Just over 2 weeks later, on November 1st, 2021, Durst is indicted for second-degree murder charges of his first wife, Kathie Durst, in Westchester, New York. However, Durst was never taken to court over this indictment because on January 10th, 2022, after his COVID contraction and a myriad of other health issues, Durst passed away at the age of 78 within the California Department of Corrections. A quick note before we begin this chapter, this video has been an absolute nightmare to make. I cannot tell you how much time and effort I've put into this. I think my eye is twitching because I am so tired, but it has been so complicated because not only is this a complicated case that spans 5 decades, but the biggest issue that I've had is that nearly everyone involved with this case and a lot of the sourcing completely contradict one another. This case is filled with exaggeration, omission, insinuation, twisting, manipulation, and lies. I try to cover it as best as a lunatic alone in their spare room with their cat can, so I will provide some additional context surrounding some of the sourcing and also the infighting and issues between a lot of the people involved in this case. As always, please feel free to browse the sourcing for further information and clarification. I love to provide the sourcing because it provides credit for those that have done the work for the articles and videos, and it also allows the audience to see where I have got this information from, and most importantly, it allows the audience to then go and read and watch all of the information themselves and come to their own conclusions. So now we are going to go over the information that I still think is important context that I wasn't able to fit anywhere else in the video. So when it comes to the Kathie Durst case, obviously there was a lot of police incompetence, and this is covered quite a lot in the JINX. In the trial, it was actually revealed that the detective that Durst first reported Kathie missing to and that initially investigated the disappearance, he actually slept with a witness from the case, which is incredibly inappropriate. There is a book that I read. It was actually the first Durst book that I read. It was called A Deadly Secret by Matt Birkenbeck. And I ended up reading 3 books for this: A Deadly Secret, Without a Trace, and Jeanine Pirro's book, He Killed Them All. So we'll talk about certain things that each of them cover. And in that book, the author very, very much is on the side of the police. He paints them in this light of being these wonder men, that he even talks about how handsome they are, and he tells a lot of personal anecdotes about them. He really lays into the fact that the police weren't incompetent and they did actually follow up on a lot of stuff, which is pretty obvious. There was a lot of incompetency, even if it was just the fact that they kept trying to dismiss the disappearance as, oh, she's run off with some other guy. There were certain things that the police did try and follow up on and investigate, but they were met with a counter narrative, and someone was exerting pressure on people to lie to the police. And it may be the same people that I mentioned who provided the media with the information about Kathie's apparent movements the day that she, or the night that she went missing. This was things like the doorman saying he saw her and the dean at the school getting the phone call, because the police wouldn't disclose that information in an open investigation. So most people believe that allegedly the Durst family were the ones who were supplying this information and also trying to bolster the narrative and movements of Kathie Durst that Robert Durst was reporting happened. For example, the doorman who said he not only saw Kathie Durst come back that night, he said that a man came over to visit her and then he saw her leave the next day. This doorman, when it was followed up with him in 1999, when they reopened the investigation, he then said he didn't actually see her, but at the time he was feeling pressure exerted on him to say that he did. And it was the same thing with the dean that I spoke about earlier, where they found out the dean actually didn't really know her and he was covering for another dean, and that all came out in 1999 too. So speaking of 1999, this is when they reopened the investigation, and Jeanine Pirro was the district attorney for Westchester that did this. She was working with a detective called Joe Becerro, and they absolutely seemed to despise each other. Jeanine Pirro really trashed him in her book, He Killed Them All, and she talks in the beginning of her issues with him about how he was the person she believes that was leaking a lot of the information to the media. And she doesn't say this exact word, but she basically calls him a clout chaser throughout the book, and she calls him Hollywood Joe. And I do think that is not funny, but interesting, because all of the sort of issues that I've ever seen anyone else have with Jeanine Pirro is the fact that they think that she is like a publicity hound. And I do think A Deadly Secret really went into a lot of Jeanine Pirro's personal life and information that probably wasn't really relevant to mention. And he did do this to a lot of the people, like the police detective that was the person Durst reported him to. He didn't mention about him sleeping with a witness, but he mentioned, oh, he's going through a divorce and how he left policing and became a consultant for law and order. But with Jeanine Pirro and Kathie's friend Gilberta, he really, the author, Matt Birkenbeck, really, really laid into them. And, you know, if he doesn't like them, that's fine. But he went really low and was like attacking their looks. And he also was claiming that Gilberta, because she's a lesbian, that she was in love with Kathie. And it's like, come on, like not every lesbian is in love with their straight friends. Like we are capable of having female friendships with people that we're not in love with. I think that by doing that, he kind of sullies a lot of the other information that he talks about Janine and Gilberta that is related to the case, because we'll get to Gilberta in a second, but Janine Pirro, at the time of the reinvestigation, she was going through a lot of issues in her personal life because her husband was actually being indicted for tax fraud and tax evasion, and she had, obviously they're married, she'd signed a lot of the tax forms and things like that. So she was really feeling a lot of stress at the time because her husband was convicted and found guilty and ended up serving time in prison, and she's the district attorney. So I'm sure that did put a lot of pressure on her, and she had kids and everything like that. One other little bit of information that I found interesting about Janine Pirro, it wasn't actually in the JINX, but it kind of was a little bit if you really are paying attention, and it involves her relationship with someone. In 2015, they actually had a screening for the last episode of the JINX at Andrew Jarecki's house, and as I said earlier, you know, he's uber wealthy from a really wealthy family. So it's this massive living room with a big projection screen, and they're showing the JINX as like sofas everywhere. And actually one of my friends was there, which I will tell you in a second, but they cut to a scene of Janine Pirro sitting on a couch with Cody Cazares, who was the detective, I believe he's a sergeant there now, in the Galveston, Texas Morris Black case. He was the detective who investigated it, and obviously I'll put video on the screen so you can see, but he and Janine are sitting next to each other, and I remember when I was watching that, I kept thinking, oh, like, I don't know what it was. It's not like they're like snuggled up together or anything, but it was like the eye contact. Eye contact's important. I mean, eye contact is basically like 90% of gaydar. So I really was kind of looking at it and thinking, maybe there's something going on there. Lo and behold, there was something going on there, as they actually talked about this at the trial, because there was a writer, Lisa DiPaolo was her name. She actually was supposed to work on Piero's book with her, but they had some falling out too, and Lisa DiPaolo was alleging there was alcohol issues and she was living in her house, so there was all this arguing going on with them. And on the stand, she outed that Janine Pirro and Cody Cazares were dating. And again, is that super relevant to the case? No, but I think it's interesting. And Janine Pirro does talk about Cody and the situation a lot in her book too. One very important thing about Janine Pirro that wasn't explored in the JINX or anything like that was the fact that Janine Pirro did have a meeting with Douglas Durst, Robert Durst's brother, and the person who's in charge of the Durst organization now. And they met at a restaurant where they closed the restaurant down, and it was just them inside meeting. And it wasn't until a lawyer, Kevin, that used to work for Janine Pirro, that ended up speaking about this, and they don't really cover much of what was said at this meeting. And a lot of the people, like Kevin, have said that when Janine Pirro had this meeting with Douglas Durst, after that, they met a lot of stonewalling when it came to trying to move the investigation forward. Obviously, she's the person in charge. She doesn't want to move forward with an investigation unless they have all the information. But then why are you meeting with Douglas Durst? And you know, nobody really knows what went on and why was it alone and in this closed down location. And obviously we can't say either way, you know, whether it was a good or a bad thing or what was discussed. Again, this is probably one of those things where we'll never really know what was talked about and if there was anything shady, but it's one of those things that you definitely side-eye, would obviously love to know, but I just thought it was important to note that. We do have our massive, huge what the fuck moment at the end, but another really surprising thing to me that came out of the A Deadly Secret book was the author talking about Gilberta Pajami, who was the woman who she was featured in the JINX and pretty much any media that you have ever seen about the Durst case. And an important thing that allegedly Gilberti didn't really be truthful about was the fact that the last time that she saw Kathie Durst, she was the last person apart from Robert Durst that saw her. Gilberti had her over at her house, and if you watch the JINX or any other media, Gilberti is talking about, oh, it was a family dinner and a low-key thing, but according to a lot of the other people who attended this party, it was a big party where lots of substances were being consumed. And a lot of people who attended spoke about the fact that Kathie had consumed a lot of white powder substance, and she also had drank a lot of alcohol, and she ended up driving home that was 45 minutes an hour away. But before she went home, she had been talking about the fact that she was going to confront Durst and she really wanted her divorce settlement, and she was going to use the documents that showed tax fraud and also the fact that Durst was embezzling funds, and he also was taking rent checks that should have been deposited into the company account and depositing them into his own. And a lot of the discussion about this in Birkenbeck's book is kind of insinuating that Kathie Durst went over to her friend's house, got intoxicated, drove home, and then she was intoxicated getting home, so confronted him. They got into an argument, and obviously we know what happened. And the way that the author lays it out, it's almost kind of blaming Gilberti for what happened, because they talk a lot about how Gilberti was, you know, encouraging her and telling her to get divorced and telling her to go ahead with it. And I do understand what they're trying to say, in the sense that, yes, if your friend is in a toxic relationship where their husband is beating the shit out of them, that they're having to go to hospital 2 weeks before, yeah, I'd be telling them to get divorced too. But I wouldn't be telling them to get intoxicated, drive an hour home. I would never let them leave. And then also to go and confront this violent man that is incredibly wealthy and powerful and has all the connections and money and assets in the world, and to go to this violent man and show him evidence that you have that could cause serious issues for him and his incredibly powerful and wealthy family. That is not advisable. So I do think that the Birkenbeck author was way too harsh, but I understand that they're trying to go over the situation that was there, as in what sort of environment Kathie was going to confront Durst in. In A Deadly Secret, Birkenbeck also talks about how other friends of Kathie's spoke about the fact that Gilberta was the one that was supplying Kathie with the substances she had problems with. And I found that so hard to believe, but I did actually look into it, and Gilberti did have 6 arrests for that substance, and one of them was a felony arrest that it was for a significant volume. So that exists. I don't obviously know black and white either way if yes, she was supplying her with this, or no, she wasn't. Also, as I mentioned earlier, I did read Janine Pirro's book too, and she does address this as well in her book, because Janine and Gilberti seem to really work closely together, and they are the two people that a lot of the other people have criticisms about when it comes to them wanting to be involved with the media a lot. And both of them wanted to profit from that media too, because Jeanine Pirro obviously books and TV and all of that. And Gilberti actually had an offer for a movie deal that was allegedly for $1 million, and she almost signed it, but all of the other friends really got angry with her and were saying, you're jeopardizing the investigation, because if you do this deal, like, you'll never be able to testify. And she was the last person that ever saw Kathie Durst, so her friends end up pressuring her into not doing it. When Pirro addresses this in her book, she goes along the lines more of Gilberti, yes, she does have the arrests and she herself did have substance problems, but she apparently only started partaking in the substances after Kathie's disappearance, but the arrest timeline and dates and stuff doesn't really support that. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, which is honestly the case a lot of the time. A last few couple of things. One thing with the Susan Berman case that really frustrated me, and I think the Jinx season 2 especially was very deceptive about this. In season 1 of the Jinx, a lot of the people are very vague about this, but then in season 2, after Durst has been on trial and been found guilty, people seem to all of a sudden remember details they didn't, or they're more sure about it, because these friends, they all talk about the fact that before Susan Berman passed away, she was talking about this huge story that she had that was going to blow the lid off everything, and it was going to be, you know, her ticket out of the financial situation, and she was going to be back on her feet. A lot of the people, especially in the Jinx, they all think and say they think that it is in regards to Durst and her coming forward about knowing Durst was involved with Kathie and that she made the phone call and stuff, but that is absolutely not the case. Yes, we know Susan Berman told Durst that the police wanted to speak to her when they didn't, but this whole case where she was talking about blowing the lid off stuff and was going to be like a big financial windfall for her, that was about a mobster wife who had turned source for her and was supplying her with a ton of information that nobody knew. And even Susan Berman, who was the daughter of a gangster, she apparently even told some friends that this information is insane, like, I'm salivating over it. And that was going to be her big story that she was breaking. And she even had this whole thing with the New York Times arranged, but obviously that never ended up happening. And they clearly all know this, because I'm sorry, there's nothing that I, a lunatic in my house with my cat, can find out in 1 month that these multi-millionaires with every resource and asset in the world that worked on the Jinx for 20 years doesn't know. The only things that I'm telling you here are obviously information and context that they have purposely left out. So the Susan Berman thing, I think there's so much more going on there too, because there was this real drive to have the Susan Berman conviction because it hinged on the Kathie Durst disappearance situation. Like, they never would have been able to get the Susan Berman conviction without proving that Durst took the life of Kathie Durst and Susan Berman helped with the phone call. And there's probably so much more to delve into there. I will just add a note too to say that when I've been looking into all of this, Susan Berman's son, Sarab, who was the one who actually discovered the letter, he actually has been speaking a lot on the Jinx Reddit. Again, everything is below. And he has really come out hard against the Jinx and the people involved, because he says that they pretty much took the letter from him. And when they took the letter and put it in that deposit box, they apparently had it for 2 years. And when it went into that deposit box, the day it was discovered, it basically started a countdown. And started the countdown because when this new evidence was discovered, they could have used that new evidence to go after Durst for some sort of financial compensation. It's like how now Kathie Durst's family have been able to go after Durst after his conviction because it was something new that was happening. And so Sarah has said that allegedly because they held on to this for 2 years, that he wasn't able to really do anything. And he also has spoken about a lot of the inaccuracies and really how Susan was portrayed, especially in the second season. And obviously, I think we can all sympathize with what an awful situation Sarah must be in. But I do think some of the information he provides on Reddit doesn't quite make sense, but it could just be that he needs to provide further clarification or he hasn't been asked the right questions. So I do think there's much more going on there. Will we ever get answers? Who knows about that? There's a lot of other stuff. Honestly, I have been filming for literally like 30 hours and I probably could do another 30, and I'm gonna try and take all the relevant stuff out and leave out any ramblings or ADHD sidelines. But there is so much more to explore. Apparently, Durst may have known Morris Black, according to a private investigator that was hired in Galveston, Texas. I've linked her site below. Her name's Bobby, and she really seems to be a thorough investigator. And she uncovered all of these other aliases that Durst was using in Florida and Virginia and California, and it was similar situations to Galveston. He would use a name of someone he went to high school with or some other affiliation, and he would rent an apartment, go to Walmart, buy the handbag and the wig, and God knows what he was doing in these places. But Bobby and Janine Pirro and a lot of other people think that Durst is actually guilty of many, many more crimes. They have tried to link him to a number of other cases where people's lives have been taken. I know it's a nightmare to talk like this. It's YouTube censorship. I really, really wish I didn't have to speak like this, but unfortunately it's just one of those things that they'll suppress the video. So when they have looked into these cases, a lot of places have been able to link him to especially taking the life of young women. So there is a lot more that could be covered, could be explored. Maybe someday there'll be a part 2. But I want to tell you the biggest what the fuck moment I had when it comes to this case, because just when you think, oh, this makes sense, and oh, there are good people that are going out there and, you know, pounding the pavement and doing the good work. And I'm not saying this changes what this person managed to achieve, but it certainly makes me side-eye them. And this is an example of these really wealthy people with a lot of power. You just never know what's really going on behind the scenes. And that is because it very, very recently just came out that the prosecutor in the Los Angeles case, the prosecutor who got Durst convicted and found guilty of taking the life of Susan Berman, John Lewin, he actually went and vacationed at Durst's house, his $20 million house that now is obviously owned by his ex-wife because he passed away. And this happened very shortly after the trial ended and Durst passed away. John Lewin took his daughter and went to the Hamptons and stayed in Deborah Sheridan's $20 million Hampton house, the Durst Hampton house. And I just could not believe that. In what world? Is it illegal? No, it's not illegal. Is it incredibly morally questionable? Why would a prosecutor who found Durst guilty go on vacation with his wife where the entire second season of the Jinx basically shows you that allegedly, Debrah Sheridan was very much involved in helping Durst avoid any sort of consequence.
It feels very wrong to get to the end of this and be like, Bob Durst, lone wolf, did terrible things and then got in trouble for it. Bob Durst did some terrible things, and a whole lot of other people helped him.
And the whole reason, allegedly, Durst married Debrah Sheridan was that he would then still be able to have someone to access his money when he was in prison, because he married her right after they reopened the investigation.
John Lewin versus Bob Durst, and Debbie was monitoring the trial from afar through the presence of her own lawyer.
I know everything going on.
There is just so much other wild, crazy stuff when you start looking into that whole side of things with Durst and his wife, but I cannot tell you how much this blew me away.
Debbie certainly had enough information to understand that Bob had likely engaged in very bad conduct.
And the reason that I absolutely know that the Jinx knew about this, and they interview Lewin. I'm sure most people have seen the Jinx if they're watching this, but Lewin is heavily featured in the entire second season of the Jinx, and at no point do they mention this. Even the last episode, that is pretty much all about Debrah Sheridan. That the last episode is just pretty much about her.
Bob Durst did some terrible things, and a whole lot of other people helped him. That includes his friends, it includes his family, and the one person in his life who's not been in the spotlight, his wife Debrah.
And they at no point mention this, even when the last shot of the Jinx is like an aerial shot of them pulling back. It's obviously not really her and really the house, but they're pulling back from what they're trying to make look like her Hampton house with her on the balcony, and they're playing this deposition that she had, and the last thing that she says, which they've manipulated this as well. They manipulated the ending with Durst in the first Jinx where he says he killed them all. They moved around a lot of the words and changed them, but when they're pulling back and Sheridan, you hear the person in the deposition ask her,
when you were dating Robert Durst, you knew that his first wife had disappeared, but you stayed with him, right?
Yes.
They've been building up to this whole thing about, oh, you were married to Durst and all of that.
After you found out that Susan BERMAN, who was Bob's close friend, had been shot in the head, you stayed by Robert's side, right?
Yes.
After he went on the run, and you found out he dismembered his elderly neighbor, you still stayed by his side, right?
Yes.
And they say to her, was it worth it? And she says, I think so.
Was there any crime that Bob could have committed that would have offended you enough to make you leave him?
I don't know.
Was it worth it?
I think it was.
And that deposition that they use in the Jinx is the deposition where Debrah Sheridan admits that Lewin went on vacation to her house.
Is owned by Debrah Sheridan, who confirmed Lewin's sleepover.
Did you know he was coming?
Yes.
Did he sleep over?
He did.
And Lewin then later in another deposition that he had to be involved in, he also admits this. And when he admits it and gets asked about it, he looks very, very surprised and shocked and flustered that he's being asked about it or that somebody else knows about it.
My daughter and I, on a vacation to New York City, made arrangements.
That was Los Angeles Deputy District Attorney John Lewin uncomfortably admitting at a videotaped deposition that he took a vacation at the Hamptons home of Robert Durst's wife, just months after Lewin prosecuted the late New York real estate heir on murder charges.
The news team, News 12, turned to Tara. They actually were the ones that found this out because the depositions got sealed because obviously they have all this money and fancy lawyers and everything like that. So it only was found out very recently, even though it was filmed a long time ago.
News 12 revealed last month that the lead prosecutor took a vacation at the Hamptons home of Durst's wife. And now there are calls for a full-blown investigation.
And they didn't include it, even though the entire point of the second season of the Jinx is look at all of these friends and family and other people that were involved with Durst that helped and enabled him to either commit these crimes or get away with them, or even just to look the other way.
He expected his friends to toe the line, and a lot of them did.
These people did that because they wanted in some way to benefit financially or just through connections or assets or materials, whatever it is.
A copy of a letter sent to the Los Angeles District Attorney from the lawyer representing the family of Durst's still missing first wife referred to several news stories of what he described as Lewin's playdate and multi-night sleepover, and accused the star prosecutor of engaging in improper and unethical conduct, something Lewin denied in his deposition.
It's nothing that is in any way unethical.
All of Durst's friends that stuck by him, they dig up, this one got a car and this one got $200,000. Like even the juror in the Galveston case that got a job with Durst and his wife got a job with Durst ended up giving him $200,000. Janine Pirro also alleges in her book that the judge in the Galveston case, she was apparently accepting money too, and Janine Pirro accuses her of all these shady things, and that wasn't talked about either. And the fact that John Lewin, the prosecutor, going and staying and vacationing with Debrah Sheridan, that absolutely should have been talked about, because they even cover in the Jinx how sometimes it is not just a money transaction thing, because they have this whole part where they explain how, well, if you look on paper that they've just handed someone $200,000, that can look shady. So sometimes they will pay their bills or pay their mortgages, whether it is for something like that where they're in some way getting something out of it, or even if it just is he got invited to go on vacation with Durst's widow. Where has that conversation come from? Why would anyone be having this conversation? How would this even come up? Maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill, but I really could not get over this, and there was so much crazy stuff in this case, whatever you want to call it, this entire saga, that it really blew me away. I'm hoping this is the final editing ash, because I owe you guys some information, because there's a few little things that I said I would address later that I forgot about when I was filming. So I'm going to run through them really, really quick. There's like 1 minute left of Lewin stuff and then we're done. So I spoke about Andrew Jarecki's dad and didn't follow up on that. His father, who is a very famous Yale psychiatrist I spoke about earlier, very extremely wealthy. Jarecki's dad has, in the past few weeks, been accused of heinous crimes. I'll put it on the screen because, again, bloody YouTube censorship. And allegedly, he was Epstein's psychiatrist for girls that Epstein was attacking. So I, again, as always, have linked all the sourcing below if you want to know more about that. But it is a very recent story. And obviously, he doesn't control what his dad does. But I just did, again, think it was something to note. I also mentioned that I knew someone, a friend, at the screening of the last episode of the Jinx at Jarecki's house, and that was actually Rosie O'Donnell. Anyone who has just had their blood pressure go up because they heard that name, do not fear, because I don't just blindly go with whatever my friends say. I've also spoken on the channel about how I've known Kayleigh McEnany for over 20 years at this stage, so now everybody's blood pressure should be up because I've covered both sides of the spectrum. One thing I didn't really give as much attention to in the conclusion as I wanted to is the fact that the Durst family has still never to this day spoken to Kathie Durst's family about any of this. They've never uttered her name again, apart from when they've been deposed. Durst's 3 siblings were all deposed. His youngest brother Tom, I believe, doesn't speak to any of the family and lives in California, but they all spoke about it, and Tom also spoke about how he really thought that Robert Durst had taken Kathie's life. I think a good kind of like example comparison of this would be to look at this case as if it was Trump, because he very much is in that 5 very wealthy New York real estate businessman sort of thing. And I'm not talking anything politically here because, as I just said, I don't really talk about politics on this channel anyway. And I think if Trump's daughter-in-law went missing, people would find it incredibly weird if he didn't even say anything or mention anything or expend any resources or try and find them, because I just can't imagine that they would do that. I'm sure if one of their kids' spouses went missing, that they would be using every resource at their disposal to try and find them, unless they absolutely know that there is no finding them. So I do think that people don't really talk enough about the family's sort of involvement in everything, and I obviously understand why, because they're extremely wealthy and powerful and everything, but there's definitely a lot more going on there. And the last final thing I forgot to mention is the fact that Robert Durst actually is innocent. I may have said something like that on the thumbnail because I always do like 5 options and one of them kind of is a bit like that, but he is technically innocent of everything, because California has this weird technicality that if you pass away when your conviction has gone through but hasn't gone through 1 round of appeals, it is completely erased, basically. So despite everything, despite them finally getting this guilty verdict just before he passed away, he is technically innocent of everything. So let's get back to the last few minutes of the video, and thank you for still being here. And also, allegedly, John Lewin and his team are going to be investigated soon, but I don't know how true that is. And if anything changes between me filming this at 9:30 on Sunday, the 23rd of June, and me putting the video up, then I will put some text on the screen. But if you are still here, I absolutely fucking love you, because this was the video of nightmares. This case was so complicated over such a long time with so many people and contradictions. It was really difficult, and I honestly think I've recorded like 30 hours of footage. So thank you a million times over for watching. Leave MVP and a little emoji below so that I can personally thank you. If you want to support the channel by subscribing, that would be amazing, but no pressure. I do have a Patreon and YouTube memberships if you're interested in more content, along with a ton of other videos on the channel. In this sort of genre, I have covered the Murdaugh trial, Danny Masterson, and just a bunch of other stuff. So check out those videos if you're interested. And I will leave my social media, my amazing editor Evelyn Dawes channel and social media, and Miss G's Instagram down below. As always, make sure to stay safe, take care of yourselves, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye, guys.